So here's something worth thinking about as you settle in tonight. Right now, as you're lying there, maybe adjusting your pillow, maybe pulling the blanket up a little. Right now, in this exact moment, there are roughly 8 million species alive on this planet. 8 million different kinds of living things, give or take. That's a lot. That's forests full of beetles and oceans full of strange, translucent creatures drifting through the dark, and fungi threading through the soil beneath every meadow you've ever walked across. 8 million species, all doing their thing, all tangled up together in this impossibly complicated web of eating and being eaten, of cooperating and competing, and just quietly existing side by side. But here's the thing. That number, 8 million, it sounds enormous, and it is. But it's also, in a way, a tiny fraction. Because over the entire history of life on Earth, the best estimates suggest that something like 5 billion species have existed at one time or another. 5 billion, which means that the vast, vast majority of every kind of living thing that has ever appeared on this planet is already gone, vanished, not here anymore. Something like 99% of all species that have ever lived are extinct, and most of them disappeared quietly, one species at a time, in what scientists call background extinction, the slow, steady, ordinary turnover of life. Species arise, they persist for a while, maybe a few million years, and then they fade out. That's normal. That's just how it works. But every once in a while, and by once in a while, I mean maybe 5 or 6 times in the last 500 million years, something much bigger happens. Something so catastrophic, so sweeping, that it doesn't just pick off a species here and there. It wipes out entire families, entire orders, entire ways of being alive. These are the mass extinctions. And they are, honestly, some of the most fascinating and humbling events in the entire history of this planet, because they reshape everything. They redraw the map of life from scratch, and the world that comes after is never, ever the same as the world that came before. That's what we're going to talk about tonight. All of them. Slowly and in order, starting from the very beginning. And I want to tell you not just what died, but why. What actually happened, what went wrong, what forces conspired, geological, chemical, astronomical, to push life to the brink over and over again. Because these aren't just lists of dead animals. These are detective stories, and some of them are still being solved. But before we get to the first great dying, we need to understand what the world looked like before any of this happened. And that means going back, way, way back, further than the dinosaurs, further than the fish, further than anything you'd recognize as an animal at all. We need to go back to a time when the most complex life on Earth was, well, slime. For most of Earth's history, and I mean the overwhelming majority of it, life was microbial. Single-celled organisms, bacteria and archaea, doing their thing in the oceans for billions of years. The Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. Life appeared surprisingly early, maybe as far back as 3.8 or even 4 billion years ago. But for the next 3 billion years or so, it stayed small, microscopically small. There were no eyes, no mouths, no bones, no brains, just cells, dividing, drifting, forming mats on the seafloor, slowly, incredibly slowly, changing the chemistry of the planet. And that chemistry part is important, because those early microbes, particularly the cyanobacteria, the ones that figured out photosynthesis, they started pumping oxygen into an atmosphere that had almost none. And oxygen, as it turns out, is a pretty reactive gas. It's corrosive. It rusts iron. And for the organisms that had evolved in a world without it, oxygen was essentially poison. So the very first great environmental catastrophe caused by life itself, sometimes called the Great Oxidation Event, around 2.4 billion years ago, was, in a sense, a mass extinction. The anaerobic organisms that couldn't tolerate oxygen were pushed to the margins, shoved into the deep mud and the oxygen-free pockets of the world where some of their descendants still live today. But we don't usually count that one among the big 5 mass extinctions because it happened so early and the life it affected was so simple. And honestly, the fossil record from that era is so sparse that we can barely read it. The mass extinctions we talk about, the famous ones, the big 5, they all happen in the last 540 million years or so. And there's a reason for that. Because about 540 million years ago, something extraordinary happened. Life got complicated. Fast. This is the Cambrian explosion, and it's one of the most remarkable chapters in the entire story of life on Earth. In a geologically brief window, maybe 20 or 30 million years, which sounds long but is a blink in deep time, animal life went from simple, soft-bodied, mostly featureless organisms to an astonishing riot of forms. Suddenly there were eyes, there were shells, there were claws and spines and segmented bodies and things with 5 eyes and a backward-facing mouth. The Burgess Shale fossils from British Columbia, discovered by Charles Walcott in 1909, give us this incredible snapshot of Cambrian weirdness. Creatures like Anomalocaris, a meter-long predator with grasping appendages and compound eyes, or Hallucigenia, which was so bizarre that scientists originally reconstructed it upside down and backwards. The point is, once complex animal life appeared, it diversified rapidly. And once you have diversity, once you have ecosystems full of interconnected species, predators and prey, reef builders and burrowers and filter feeders, you also have vulnerability. Because now, if something disrupts the environment badly enough, you're not just killing individual organisms. You're collapsing entire ecological networks. You're pulling threads out of a web, and at some point, the whole thing comes apart. So, let's talk about the first of the big 5. The first truly massive extinction event in the fossil record of complex life. It happened around 445 million years ago, at the end of the Ordovician period. And to understand it, you need to picture a world that looks almost nothing like the one you know. In the late Ordovician, the continents were in completely different positions. Most of the major land masses were clustered in the southern hemisphere, with a giant continent called Gondwana sitting right over the South Pole. The northern hemisphere was mostly ocean, and that ocean was warm and shallow and absolutely teeming with life. This was the golden age of marine invertebrates. The seas were full of brachiopods. They look a bit like clams, but they're actually quite different animals, and trilobites, those iconic 3-lobed arthropods with their segmented bodies and compound eyes. There were crinoids, which are related to starfish, but look like underwater flowers swaying on long stalks. There were bryozoans, colonial animals that built lacy, delicate structures on the seafloor. There were early corals forming the first real reef systems. Graptolites, tiny colonial organisms that floated in the water column, were everywhere, and they're so useful for dating rocks that geologists love them. Life was almost entirely in the ocean at this point. On land, there was basically nothing. Maybe some algal crusts, maybe some very early mosses beginning to creep onto the edges of shorelines, but no forests, no insects, no animals of any kind. The continents were barren rock and sand and ice. All the action was in the water, and in the water, things were going beautifully. The Ordovician had seen what's sometimes called the Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event, a sustained explosion of new species and new ecological niches that tripled the number of marine families. Life was more diverse than it had ever been. The oceans were, by any measure, thriving. And then, over a span of maybe 1 million years, which in geological terms is startlingly fast, something like 85% of all marine species disappeared. Now, think about what that means. 85%. Picture a coral reef, bustling and colorful and full of movement. Now remove 85 out of every 100 species. What's left isn't a reef anymore. It's a graveyard. So what happened? What could possibly kill that much life, that quickly, in a world that had been doing so well? The answer, as best we can tell, is ice. The end Ordovician extinction appears to have been driven primarily by a severe glaciation, an ice age that came on fast and hit hard. Gondwana, that massive southern continent, was positioned right over the South Pole, and for reasons that are still debated, possibly related to a drawdown of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, possibly triggered by enhanced weathering of newly exposed rock from tectonic activity. The planet cooled dramatically. Glaciers spread across Gondwana. Ice sheets grew to enormous size, and when you lock up that much water and ice on land, sea levels drop. They drop a lot. Estimates vary, but the sea level may have fallen by 50 to 100 meters or more. And here's why that matters so much. Remember, almost all complex life at this point lived in shallow marine environments. Continental shelves, those gently sloping underwater margins around the continents, that's where the reefs were. That's where the brachiopods and trilobites and crinoids lived. When sea levels plummeted, those shallow seas simply drained away. Vast areas of habitat, millions of square kilometers of productive, life-sustaining shallow ocean, were suddenly exposed as dry land. It's as if someone pulled the plug on a bathtub and all the creatures living in the water had nowhere to go. But it wasn't just the habitat loss. The cooling itself was devastating. Tropical and subtropical species, the ones that had evolved in warm, stable oceans, suddenly found themselves in a world that was getting colder and colder. Ocean circulation patterns changed. Nutrient cycling was disrupted. The chemistry of the seawater shifted. Cold water holds more dissolved oxygen than warm water, which sounds like it should be a good thing. But the reorganization of ocean chemistry can create dead zones in some areas, while over-oxygenating others, and the organisms adapted to specific conditions simply couldn't cope. And this is what makes the end Ordovician extinction particularly interesting and particularly cruel. The glaciation ended. The ice melted. Sea levels rose again. And you might think, okay, great. The habitat comes back. The survivors can recolonize. Things should recover. But the second pulse of extinction hit during the warming. Because as the glaciers melted and the oceans warmed back up, the deep ocean waters, which had become oxygen-rich during the cold period, were replaced by warmer, oxygen-poor water. Anoxia, the absence of oxygen, spread across the seafloor, and many of the species that had managed to survive the cold phase were now killed by the warm phase. It was a 1-2 punch. Cold, then warm, each bringing its own particular flavor of catastrophe. The end Ordovician extinction came in 2 distinct pulses, separated by maybe 500,000 to 1 million years. The first pulse, associated with the onset of glaciation, primarily hit species living in warm, shallow tropical waters. The second pulse, associated with the end of glaciation and the return of warm, anoxic conditions, finished off many of the survivors. Together, they made this one of the most severe extinctions in Earth's history. Some analyses rank it as the second worst of all time, behind only the Great Permian extinction that we'll get to later. The victims were staggering in their variety. Trilobite diversity was cut roughly in half. Brachiopod families were devastated. The graptolites, those floating colonial organisms, were nearly wiped out, though a few lineages clung on and would later rediversify. Reef ecosystems collapsed entirely and wouldn't fully recover for millions of years. The conodonts, enigmatic eel-like creatures known mostly from their tiny tooth-like fossils, took heavy losses. Entire ecological communities that had taken tens of millions of years to assemble were dismantled in what amounted to a geological instant. And yet, and this is something I find quietly beautiful about the story of life, it came back. It always comes back. Not the same, never the same. The species that were lost forever, but the survivors radiated into the empty niches, evolved new forms, built new communities. The Silurian period that followed the Ordovician saw a gradual rebuilding of marine ecosystems, new kinds of reef builders, new groups rising to prominence. Life is, if nothing else, relentless in its capacity to fill available space. But here's what I keep coming back to when I think about the end Ordovician extinction. It was caused, fundamentally, by the planet doing something the planet does all the time, shifting its climate. There was no asteroid, no supervolcano, as far as we know. Just the slow, massive machinery of plate tectonics moving a continent over the pole, and the atmosphere and oceans responding in ways that happened to be catastrophic for the life that existed at that moment. The Earth wasn't trying to kill anything. It was just being the Earth, and the life that had flourished in one set of conditions simply couldn't survive when those conditions changed too fast. That idea, that the very stability life depends on is always, always temporary, is one of the deepest lessons of the extinction record. And it's a lesson that gets repeated in different ways, with different mechanisms, across every one of the great dyings that followed. The next one came about 70 million years later, near the end of the Devonian period, in a world that had changed almost beyond recognition. Because by the late Devonian, something genuinely new had happened on Earth. Life had finally, fully, irreversibly moved onto land, and the consequences of that were staggering, not just for the organisms making that transition, but for the entire planet. Because when plants colonized the land, they didn't just passively sit there soaking up sunlight. They actively transformed the world around them, and that transformation set the stage for one of the most prolonged and mysterious extinction events in the entire geological record. Let me paint the picture for you. By around 380 million years ago, in the late Devonian, the land that had been barren rock and sand during the Ordovician extinction was now covered, in many places, with actual forests. Not the kinds of forests you'd recognize. These were forests of strange, towering plants called Archaeopteris, which looked a bit like a cross between a fern and a conifer, with frond-like leaves on woody trunks that could reach heights of 30 meters or more. They had deep root systems, something their predecessors lacked, and those roots were doing something that no living thing had ever done before on that scale. They were breaking apart rock. They were creating soil. They were reaching down into the substrate and chemically weathering minerals, pulling out nutrients, and in the process, they were fundamentally altering the chemistry of rivers, of groundwater, and ultimately of the oceans themselves. Think about that for a second. For billions of years, Rock weathering on land had been a purely geological process, rain and wind and freeze-thaw cycles slowly grinding stone into sediment. Now, suddenly, you had living organisms accelerating that process enormously. Roots prying open cracks, organic acids dissolving minerals, and all that freshly weathered material, rich in phosphorus, iron, and other nutrients, was washing into rivers and flowing out to sea. And here's where it gets interesting. When you dump a huge load of nutrients into the ocean, you get exactly what you'd expect: an explosion of life at the surface. Algal blooms, massive, choking green blooms of photosynthetic organisms that spread across shallow seas. And when those organisms die and sink, their decomposition consumes oxygen. The deeper waters go anoxic, oxygen-starved. The same basic mechanism, actually, that contributed to the second killing pulse in the Ordovician, but this time driven by a completely different cause. Not by warming after glaciation, but by the biological transformation of the land surface. Life on land was, in a very real sense, poisoning life in the sea. Now, the late Devonian extinction is genuinely strange compared to the others, and I want to be upfront about that. It's sometimes called the late Devonian mass extinction, but it's really more like a prolonged crisis, a series of extinction pulses spread across roughly 20 to 25 million years, from about 380 to 360 million years ago. There are at least two major pulses that stand out. The first is called the Kellwasser event, around 372 million years ago, and the second is the Hengenberg event, around 359 million years ago, right at the very end of the Devonian. Some researchers argue these should almost be treated as separate extinctions. Others see them as peaks in a longer, rolling catastrophe. The truth is probably somewhere in between, and the exact mechanisms are still debated. This is one of those extinctions where paleontologists will cheerfully argue with each other for hours about what really happened, and nobody walks away fully satisfied. But here's what we do know. The Devonian seas were extraordinary. This was the age of fishes, and I mean that almost literally. The oceans were dominated by an incredible diversity of fish. Armored placoderms, some of them enormous, like Dunkleosteus, which was a predator roughly the size of a school bus with jaws that could bite through almost anything. There were early sharks, ray-finned fishes, lobe-finned fishes, the group that would eventually give rise to all land vertebrates, including you and me. The reefs were spectacular too, built not primarily by corals as we know them today, but by a group of organisms called stromatoporoids, along with tabulate and rugose corals. These reef systems were among the most extensive in Earth's history, stretching across shallow tropical seas. And then, during the Kellwasser event, those reef ecosystems simply collapsed. Not gradually, not with a slow decline. They were devastated. The stromatoporoids were nearly wiped out. The tabulate and rugose corals took massive losses. Reef building essentially stopped for millions of years afterward. There's actually a term for this. Paleontologists call it a reef gap, a long stretch of geological time where you just don't find significant reef structures in the rock record. The late Devonian reef gap lasted something like 15 million years. Imagine the Great Barrier Reef vanishing, and nothing comparable replacing it for 15 million years. That's the scale of what happened. The Kellwasser event also hit heavily among brachiopods, which had been among the most common animals on the seafloor, and among the armored placoderms. Trilobites, those resilient survivors of the Ordovician, took another devastating hit. They'd never fully recover their former diversity. By the time the Devonian was over, The trilobites were reduced to just a handful of lineages, shadows of their former glory, limping toward their final extinction at the end of the Permian. So what caused all this? The nutrient runoff from those new land forests was almost certainly part of the story. The spread of deep-rooted plants accelerated weathering, flushed phosphorus and other nutrients into the oceans, fueled algal blooms, and drove widespread anoxia in deeper waters. You can actually see the evidence for this in the rock record. The Kellwasser horizons are marked by black shales, dark, organic-rich sediments that form in oxygen-depleted conditions. When you find black shale in the geological record, it's almost always a sign that something has gone very wrong with ocean circulation or chemistry. But nutrient loading probably wasn't the only factor. There's evidence that global temperatures were fluctuating during this period, with cooling episodes that may have been linked again to those land plants. Here's the connection. As forests spread and pulled carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis and enhanced weathering, they may have actually drawn down atmospheric CO2 enough to trigger cooling. Some researchers have found evidence of glaciation during parts of the late Devonian, particularly toward the end, around the time of the Hagenberg event. So you have this remarkable feedback loop. Plants colonize land, they draw down CO2, the climate cools, sea levels drop, marine habitats shrink, and the organisms that had evolved for warm, shallow seas find themselves in a world that's suddenly less hospitable. And here's the thing that makes the late Devonian extinction feel different from the Ordovician one. In the Ordovician, the cause was essentially external to life. Plate tectonics moved a continent to the pole, and the climate responded. Life was a passive victim, but in the late Devonian, life itself was a major driver of the catastrophe. The evolution of forests changed the atmosphere, changed the oceans, changed the climate. Organisms that had evolved in one world inadvertently created conditions that were lethal for other organisms. It's one of the earliest and most dramatic examples of what you might call ecological engineering gone wrong. Not through any intention, obviously, but through the sheer scale of biological impact on planetary systems. There are other suspects too, and I should mention them because the late Devonian extinction is genuinely a puzzle with multiple pieces. Some researchers have pointed to large igneous provinces, massive volcanic eruptions, as a contributing factor. The Vilui traps in what is now Siberia erupted around the time of the Kellwasser event, and large volcanic eruptions can release enormous quantities of CO2 and sulfur dioxide, disrupting climate in complex ways. There's also been some discussion of bolide impacts, asteroid or comet strikes, and there is at least one candidate impact structure, the Siljan Ring in Sweden, that dates to roughly the right time period, though the dating is uncertain and the connection to the extinction is far from established. The honest answer is that the late Devonian extinction was probably caused by multiple factors acting together, reinforcing each other in ways that made the total impact far worse than any single cause could have produced on its own. That's actually a pattern you'll see again and again in extinction studies. The really devastating events tend to involve a pile-up of stresses, not just one clean cause. It's rarely as simple as an asteroid did it, or a volcano did it. Usually it's more like the climate was already shifting, and then the oceans lost oxygen, and then something else tipped the balance, and the whole system came apart. The Hagenberg event, the second major pulse, is particularly interesting because it seems to have been the one that really reshuffled the deck in terms of vertebrate evolution. The great armored placoderms, which had been the dominant predators of the Devonian seas, were completely wiped out, gone, every single lineage. and in their place, sharks and bony fishes radiated into the newly emptied ecological roles. If you've ever wondered why sharks became such successful predators, part of the answer traces back to this moment. The Hangenberg event cleared the field for them. Meanwhile, on land, the vertebrates that had been making their tentative first steps out of the water, the early tetrapods, four-limbed creatures evolved from lobe-finned fishes, also seem to have been affected. There's a gap in the tetrapod fossil record right around this time, sometimes called Roemer's Gap, after the paleontologist Alfred Roemer, who first noticed it. For a stretch of about 15 million years in the early Carboniferous, tetrapod fossils become extremely rare. Whether this represents a real decline in tetrapod diversity or just a gap in our fossil record is still debated, but recent discoveries in Scotland, at a site called Blue Beach in Nova Scotia and another near the town of Churnside, have started to fill in some of those missing pages. What emerged on the other side of the late Devonian extinction was a world transformed. The Carboniferous period that followed is one of the most remarkable chapters in Earth's history, and it was shaped directly by the aftermath of the Devonian crisis, because those forests that had helped trigger the extinction, they didn't go away. They kept spreading, kept evolving, kept pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. And in the Carboniferous, they did something that had never happened before and has never happened since on quite the same scale. The trees grew, they fell, and they didn't decompose. Not fully. Because the fungi and bacteria that break down wood today, specifically the organisms that can digest lignin, the tough structural polymer that makes wood woody, hadn't fully evolved yet. So the dead trees just piled up, layer after layer, year after year, millennium after millennium, and those layers of unrotted wood were eventually buried, compressed, and transformed into something you've almost certainly encountered in your daily life, something that powered the Industrial Revolution and still generates a significant fraction of the world's electricity. They became coal. The Carboniferous period literally means coal-bearing, and the vast coal deposits that fueled the rise of modern civilization were laid down in those ancient swamp forests in the aftermath of the Devonian extinction. And those coal swamps, those dense, humid, oxygen-rich forests of the Carboniferous, created conditions that were unlike anything the world had seen before. Atmospheric oxygen levels climbed to extraordinary heights, possibly as high as 35%, compared to about 21% today. And in that oxygen-rich air, insects grew to sizes that seem almost impossible by modern standards. Dragonflies with wingspans of 70 centimeters, millipede-like creatures over 2 meters long. It was a world of giants made possible by atmospheric chemistry that was itself a consequence of the Devonian extinction and the forests that survived it. But that world, too, was fragile, and the next great dying, the one that dwarfs all others, the one that came closest to ending complex life on Earth entirely, was already being set in motion by forces deep beneath the surface. Because by the late Permian period, around 260 million years ago, the continents had drifted together into a single enormous landmass called Pangaea, and beneath what is now Siberia, something was stirring in the mantle that would soon unleash the most devastating catastrophe in the entire history of life on Earth. And to understand just how bad it got, you need to picture the world as it was right before everything fell apart. Because the late Permian wasn't some desolate wasteland waiting to be destroyed. It was thriving. Life had come a long way since those Carboniferous coal swamps. The giant insects had mostly shrunk back down as oxygen levels gradually declined, but the land was now fully colonized in ways it hadn't been before. There were vast forests of conifers and seed ferns. There were complex ecosystems with herbivores and predators and scavengers, all interacting in food webs that would look recognizable to you, at least in their broad outlines. The dominant large animals on land weren't dinosaurs. They hadn't appeared yet, but synapsids, a group that includes the ancestors of all modern mammals, including you. Some of these synapsids were enormous. Moschops, for instance, was a barrel-bodied herbivore the size of a cow, with a thick skull it may have used for headbutting contests. Inostrancevia was a saber-toothed predator that could have looked you in the eye. These weren't primitive, sluggish creatures. Many of them were probably warm-blooded, or at least moving in that direction. They had differentiated teeth, incisors, canines, molars, just like you do. They were, in a very real sense, your distant relatives. In the oceans, life was even more diverse. Reef ecosystems had finally recovered from the Devonian collapse, built now by different organisms, but just as rich and complex. Brachiopods still carpeted the seafloor. Crinoids, those graceful, flower-like relatives of starfish, waved in the currents by the billions. Ammonites spiraled through the water column. Trilobites were still hanging on, diminished from their glory days, but still present, still doing their thing after more than 250 million years of existence. The oceans were full. The land was full. Life was diverse and abundant and deeply interconnected. And then, around 252 million years ago, the Earth essentially tried to kill everything. The end Permian extinction, sometimes called the Great Dying, and that name is not an exaggeration, wiped out roughly 90 to 96% of all marine species and about 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species. Some estimates put the total species loss even higher. To put that in perspective, remember that the end Ordovician extinction, which we talked about earlier, was devastating. 85% of marine species gone. The Great Dying was worse, significantly worse. It came closer to sterilizing the planet of complex life than any other event in the fossil record. If you could somehow graph the diversity of life on Earth over the last 500 million years, the end Permian would show up as this terrifying cliff, this almost vertical plunge that makes every other extinction look modest by comparison. So what happened? What could possibly kill that much of life on Earth? The answer starts with those stirrings beneath Siberia that we were just getting to. Deep in the Earth's mantle, an enormous plume of superheated rock was rising toward the surface. And when it broke through, it didn't produce a single volcano. It produced something almost incomprehensibly larger. What erupted across what is now Siberia was a flood basalt province, a type of volcanic event so massive that it's hard to even wrap your mind around the scale. The Siberian traps, as they're called, traps, coming from a Swedish word for stairs, because the layered lava flows create a step-like landscape, covered an area of roughly 2 million square kilometers with basalt. That's an area larger than Western Europe. Some estimates suggest the original extent was even bigger, with portions since eroded or buried. The lava flows were in some places several kilometers thick, and these eruptions didn't happen in a single dramatic blast. They continued, on and off, for roughly 1 million years, maybe longer. Now here's the thing about flood basalts. The lava itself is destructive, obviously. Anything in its path is simply buried under molten rock. But the lava isn't actually the main killer, not even close. What makes flood basalts so deadly? What makes them capable of triggering global mass extinctions is what they release into the atmosphere. And the Siberian traps were especially nasty in this regard because of where they erupted. The magma rising through the crust in Siberia had to pass through enormous deposits of limestone, coal, and evaporites, mineral deposits containing things like halite and anhydrite. Think about that for a second. Remember all that coal we were just talking about? The unrotted wood from the Carboniferous swamp forests? Some of those very deposits, or ones formed by similar processes, were sitting right in the path of this rising magma. When superheated magma intrudes into coal beds, it doesn't just melt them, it bakes them, volatilizes them, essentially cooking out the carbon and releasing it as carbon dioxide and methane. When it hits limestone, same thing. CO2 is liberated. When it hits evaporites containing sulfur compounds, it releases sulfur dioxide. And when it encounters deposits containing chlorine and fluorine-bearing minerals, it produces hydrochloric acid and hydrofluoric acid. So the Siberian traps weren't just pouring lava across the landscape. They were essentially operating as a giant geological chemistry set, cooking the surrounding rocks and injecting truly staggering quantities of greenhouse gases, acid-forming compounds, and toxic volatiles directly into the atmosphere. Some researchers have estimated that the eruptions released enough CO2 to raise atmospheric concentrations to levels several times higher than today's, and they may have released enough methane to make things even worse, since methane is a far more potent greenhouse gas molecule for molecule. And this is where the killing mechanisms start to cascade, and it gets genuinely frightening in its complexity, because it wasn't just one thing that killed 90+% of species. It was a chain reaction, a series of interlocking catastrophes that fed on each other. First, the massive CO2 and methane release drove rapid global warming. Temperatures rose by perhaps 8 to 10 degrees Celsius globally, and possibly more in some regions. Ocean surface temperatures in the tropics may have reached 35 to 40 degrees Celsius, hot enough that many marine organisms simply couldn't survive. Think about that. Water temperatures approaching those of a hot tub across vast stretches of ocean. Most marine life is ectothermic, meaning its body temperature matches its environment. There's an upper limit to what enzymes can handle, what proteins can tolerate. Push past that limit, and biochemistry just stops working. But the warming did something else, something arguably even more devastating. Warm water holds less dissolved oxygen than cold water. As the oceans heated up, they began to lose their oxygen, and at the same time, the warming disrupted ocean circulation patterns. Normally, cold, dense, oxygen-rich water sinks at the poles and flows along the ocean floor, ventilating the deep ocean. But when the temperature difference between the poles and the equator decreases, which is exactly what happens during extreme greenhouse warming, that circulation weakens or even stalls. The deep ocean becomes stagnant. Oxygen levels plummet. And this is the condition we keep encountering in these extinction stories: ocean anoxia. Except during the end Permian, the anoxia was more severe and more widespread than at any other time in the Phanerozoic. Some geochemical evidence suggests that up to 90% of the ocean floor became anoxic, or even euxinic, meaning not just oxygen-free, but actively poisonous, saturated with hydrogen sulfide produced by anaerobic bacteria. Hydrogen sulfide. That's the gas that smells like rotten eggs, and it's lethally toxic to most aerobic life even in tiny concentrations. Now imagine entire ocean basins saturated with it. Some researchers, notably Lee Kump and his colleagues, have proposed that hydrogen sulfide levels in the late Permian oceans became so extreme that the gas actually bubbled up out of the ocean and into the atmosphere, poisoning terrestrial life as well. There's even a hypothesis that the hydrogen sulfide reached high enough into the atmosphere to damage the ozone layer, stripping away the planet's protection against ultraviolet radiation. If that happened, and the evidence is debated but intriguing, then life on land would have been hit with a double blow: toxic air and increased UV exposure. Meanwhile, the sulfur dioxide from the eruptions was forming sulfuric acid aerosols in the atmosphere, producing acid rain that devastated terrestrial vegetation. Forests died, soil eroded. The evidence for this is written in the rock record. There's a dramatic shift in the types of spores and pollen found in sediments right at the extinction boundary. Complex plant pollen disappears and is replaced by fungal spores and the spores of simple, weedy plants. Some sections show what paleontologists call a fungal spike, a layer dominated by fungal remains, suggesting that for a period, the land surface was essentially a rotting wasteland being consumed by fungi. The forests were gone, and what remained was decay. And here's what's really haunting about the end Permian. It wasn't quick. The main pulse of extinction may have played out over tens of thousands of years, maybe longer. That sounds like a long time by human standards, but in geological terms, it's essentially instantaneous. Yet for the organisms living through it, it was a slow-motion apocalypse. Generations of creatures being born into a world that was getting progressively worse, hotter, more toxic, less oxygenated, with no relief in sight. The recovery was agonizingly slow. After most mass extinctions, life bounces back within a few million years. After the end Permian, full recovery took roughly 10 million years. For the first several million years of the Triassic period that followed, ecosystems were simplified, impoverished, dominated by a handful of disaster taxa, the opportunistic survivors that could tolerate the harsh conditions. In the oceans, reefs essentially vanished and didn't fully return for millions of years. On land, one genus in particular came to dominate in a way that's almost eerie. Lystrosaurus, a pig-sized synapsid, a distant relative of ours actually, became so overwhelmingly abundant that its fossils make up as much as 90% of terrestrial vertebrate specimens from the early Triassic in some locations. Imagine a world where almost every land animal you encounter is the same species. That's how depleted things were. But life did recover. It always does, given enough time. And the recovery from the Great Dying set the stage for an entirely new world. Because the synapsids, our relatives, the group that had dominated the Permian, were knocked back so severely that they never fully reclaimed their dominance. Into the ecological vacuum stepped a group that had been minor players before the extinction, small and inconspicuous, waiting in the wings without knowing they were waiting. The archosaurs. And from the archosaurs would come the creatures that would define the next 180 million years of Earth's history, the animals that captivate children and adults alike, the most successful large land animals the planet has ever produced, the dinosaurs. But before the dinosaurs could truly rise to dominance, before they could spread across every continent and evolve into thousands of species ranging from sparrow-sized to building-sized, there was one more catastrophe to get through. Because the Triassic period, that recovery interval after the Great Dying, ended with its own mass extinction, smaller than the end Permian, but still devastating, still world-changing. And the cause, remarkably, was almost the same. Because around 201 million years ago, as Pangaea began to crack apart and the Atlantic Ocean started to open for the very first time, another enormous pulse of volcanic activity was unleashing itself along what we now call the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, or CAMP for short. And here's the thing about CAMP. It was enormous. We're talking about one of the largest volcanic events in Earth's entire history, covering an area that, when you reconstruct where the lava flows ended up, stretches across parts of what is now eastern North America, western Africa, northern South America, and southwestern Europe. 4 continents. Because remember, at this point, those land masses were all still joined together in the supercontinent Pangaea, and the volcanism was happening right along the seams where the continent was beginning to tear itself apart. Picture it like this. You've got this massive single landmass, and deep in the mantle, enormous convection currents are pushing upward, stretching the crust, thinning it, cracking it. And along those cracks, magma wells up, not as neat little volcanoes, but as vast outpourings of basaltic lava flooding across the landscape in sheets. The same basic mechanism as the Siberian traps that caused the Great Dying, just in a different place, at a different time, roughly 50 million years later. And the parallels don't stop there. Just like the Siberian traps, the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province released staggering amounts of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. The eruptions came in pulses, probably 4 or 5 major phases spread over about 600,000 years, and the total volume of lava produced was something like 11 million cubic kilometers. That's hard to wrap your head around, so think of it this way. If you took all that lava and spread it evenly across the entire surface of the Earth, land and ocean alike, it would form a layer about 20 meters thick. That's a 6-story building made of solid basalt, covering the entire planet, and the gases that came with it were proportionally immense. Now, the Triassic world that this volcanism disrupted was a fascinating place, and it's worth pausing for a moment to appreciate what was living and thriving before everything went wrong. The early Triassic, right after the Great Dying, had been that impoverished world dominated by Lystrosaurus and not much else. But by the late Triassic, life had diversified beautifully. The archosaurs had split into 2 major lineages, one leading toward crocodilians and their relatives, and the other toward dinosaurs and eventually birds. And here's what surprises a lot of people. During the late Triassic, it was the crocodilian line archosaurs that were actually the dominant group. They came in an astonishing variety of forms. There were large predators that walked upright on 2 legs, looking superficially like theropod dinosaurs. There were armored herbivores. There were sleek, fast-running hunters. The croc-line archosaurs had basically filled many of the ecological roles that dinosaurs would later occupy. The actual dinosaurs, meanwhile, were present but relatively modest, small to medium-sized, making up maybe 10 to 20% of terrestrial vertebrate communities in most ecosystems. They were successful, sure, but they weren't dominant. Not yet. In the oceans, the late Triassic had seen a wonderful recovery of marine life. Coral reefs had rebuilt themselves, though the reef-building organisms were different from the ones that had been wiped out in the Permian. Scleractinian corals, the group that still builds reefs today, had taken over from the tabulate and rugose corals that had been lost. Ammonites were thriving again, their coiled shells drifting through warm Triassic seas. Conodonts, those tiny eel-like creatures with mineralized tooth-like structures that had survived every previous extinction, were still around. Marine reptiles had evolved and diversified. Ichthyosaurs shaped like dolphins, long-necked nothosaurs, the bizarre placodonts that crushed shellfish with flattened teeth. It was a rich, complex world. And then, the eruptions began. The killing mechanisms of the end Triassic extinction follow a pattern that should feel familiar by now, because it's essentially the same playbook as the end Permian, just dialed down slightly in intensity. Massive CO2 injection, caused rapid global warming. Estimates suggest temperatures rose by 3 to 4 degrees Celsius in a geologically brief window. Ocean acidification followed, as all that excess carbon dioxide dissolved into seawater and formed carbonic acid, dropping the pH and making it increasingly difficult for organisms with calcium carbonate shells or skeletons to build and maintain their structures. This hit the reef-building corals especially hard. The scleractinian reefs that had spent tens of millions of years recovering from the Permian collapse were devastated again. Ammonites took heavy losses. Conodonts, those incredible survivors that had persisted for over 300 million years through the Ordovician extinction, through the Devonian crises, through the Great Dying itself, finally met their end. The end Triassic extinction is where the conodonts disappear from the fossil record for good. There's something poignant about that, isn't there? 300 million years of survival, adapting through catastrophe after catastrophe, and then this one finally does them in. On land, the effects were equally dramatic, though in a different way. The crocline archosaurs, those diverse and dominant animals that had ruled late Triassic terrestrial ecosystems, were decimated. Most of their lineages went extinct, and the survivors were pushed into a much narrower range of ecological roles, eventually becoming the semi-aquatic ambush predators we know today as crocodilians. And with their competitors, and many of their predators suddenly gone, the dinosaurs stepped into the void. This is one of those moments in Earth's history where you can see so clearly how extinction and opportunity are two sides of the same coin. The dinosaurs didn't outcompete the crocline archosaurs in some grand evolutionary battle. They didn't prove themselves superior through millions of years of head-to-head ecological struggle. They simply survived a catastrophe that their competitors didn't, and then they expanded into the emptied world. Luck, timing. Whatever qualities happened to make them slightly more resilient to the specific stresses of that particular extinction, maybe their respiratory systems, maybe their metabolic rates, maybe something about their reproductive strategies, those qualities weren't better in any absolute sense. They were just better suited to surviving that specific crisis. And so the Jurassic period began with the dinosaurs finally ascending to dominance, a position they would hold for the next 135 million years. Think about that timescale for a moment. Our entire lineage, from the earliest recognizable hominids to you lying here right now, spans maybe 6 or 7 million years. The dinosaurs ruled for more than 20 times that long. They had time to evolve into an almost unimaginable diversity of forms. The massive sauropods with their long necks reaching into forest canopies, the armored ankylosaurs, the horned ceratopsians, the terrifying tyrannosaurs, the clever dromaeosaurs with their sickle claws, and of course, the lineage that would eventually sprout feathers and take to the air, becoming the birds that sing outside your window in the morning. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because between the end Triassic extinction and the big one, the famous one, the one everybody knows about, there's a long stretch of time. And during that stretch, something worth noting happens. Or rather, doesn't happen. For roughly 135 million years, from about 201 million years ago to 66 million years ago, there is no mass extinction. There are smaller crises, regional disruptions, turnovers in certain groups, an event in the early Toarcian age around 183 million years ago, linked to yet another large igneous province that caused significant marine disruption, but nothing that rises to the level of a true mass extinction. And that's interesting in itself, because it tells you something about how rare these events actually are. Even on geological timescales, mass extinctions are uncommon. They require a very specific set of circumstances, a trigger large enough and sustained enough to overwhelm the biosphere's considerable capacity to absorb and adapt to change. So let's talk about the one everyone's been waiting for. The end Cretaceous extinction. 66 million years ago, the day the dinosaurs died. And I say day almost literally, because unlike every extinction we've discussed so far, the slow glacial pulses of the Ordovician, the prolonged anoxic crises of the Devonian, the million-year volcanic nightmares of the Permian and Triassic, this one had a very specific, very sudden, very violent trigger. An asteroid. Now, the story of how we figured this out is one of the great detective stories in the history of science, and it's worth telling properly, because for a long time, nobody knew what had killed the dinosaurs. It was one of the biggest mysteries in paleontology. For most of the 20th century, hypotheses ranged from climate change to disease to mammals eating dinosaur eggs. That was a real theory that was seriously proposed, to the idea that dinosaurs were simply evolutionary dead ends that had run their course. None of these explanations were particularly satisfying, and none of them could account for the sheer breadth of the extinction, which didn't just kill the non-avian dinosaurs, but also wiped out the pterosaurs, the mosasaurs, the plesiosaurs, the ammonites, and roughly 75% of all species on Earth. The breakthrough came in 1980, and it came from an unlikely source, not a paleontologist, but a physicist. Luis Alvarez was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist at the University of California, Berkeley, and his son Walter was a geologist studying limestone formations in Italy near the medieval town of Gubbio. Walter had been examining a thin layer of clay that sat right at the boundary between Cretaceous and Paleogene rocks, the exact moment in the geological record when the dinosaurs disappeared. Below the clay layer, the limestone was full of foraminifera fossils, tiny marine organisms. Above it, the fossils were dramatically different, representing the impoverished post-extinction world, and the clay layer itself seemed to represent a gap, a moment when normal sedimentation had been disrupted by something. Walter mentioned this curious clay layer to his father, and Luis had an idea. If they could figure out how long that clay layer took to be deposited, they might learn something about the extinction's timing. Luis suggested measuring the concentration of iridium in the clay. Iridium is rare in Earth's crust, but arrives at a relatively constant rate from space, carried by the slow rain of micrometeorites and cosmic dust that perpetually falls on our planet. The idea was simple. If the clay layer had a normal amount of iridium, it was deposited quickly. If it had a lot, it accumulated slowly, concentrating the steady cosmic drizzle over a long period. But when the results came back from the lab, they were shocking. The iridium concentration in that clay layer wasn't just elevated, it was 30 times higher than normal. 30 times. That wasn't consistent with slow deposition. That was consistent with a sudden, massive influx of extraterrestrial material. And the only thing that could deliver that much iridium all at once was an asteroid impact, a big one. Luis and Walter Alvarez, along with chemists Frank Asaro and Helen Michel, published their findings in 1980, proposing that a large asteroid, roughly 10 kilometers in diameter, had struck the Earth 66 million years ago and caused the mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous. The reaction from the scientific community was, to put it mildly, mixed. A lot of paleontologists were furious. Here was a physicist waltzing into their field and proposing a catastrophic, almost science fiction-like explanation for the most important event in their discipline's history. Many geologists and paleontologists favored gradualist explanations. They pointed out that the Deccan traps, another massive flood basalt province in what is now India, had been erupting around the same time and could account for the extinction through the same volcanic mechanisms that had driven the Permian and Triassic events. The debate was fierce, sometimes bitter, and it lasted for over a decade. But the evidence kept accumulating in favor of the impact hypothesis. Iridium anomalies were found at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary at sites all over the world, not just in Italy, but in Denmark, New Zealand, the deep ocean floor, everywhere anyone looked. Then came the discovery of shocked quartz grains in the boundary layer, quartz crystals that had been deformed by pressures so extreme that only a hypervelocity impact could produce them. Then, tiny glass spherules called tektites, formed when rock is melted by an impact and flung into the atmosphere, where it solidifies into tiny droplets before raining back down. These tektites were showing up in the boundary clay at dozens of sites, and when researchers analyzed their chemical composition, they found signatures consistent with a single enormous impact event. The glass had been formed from vaporized rock, continental crust specifically, and its chemistry pointed toward a target site that contained a particular mix of limestone and evaporate minerals. So now the question became, where? Where on Earth was the crater? Because here's the thing. If a 10-kilometer asteroid really did hit the planet, it would have left a mark. A very, very large mark. We're talking a crater somewhere on the order of 150 to 200 kilometers across. That's not something you just lose. Except, of course, you can lose it because the Earth is not a museum. It's a living, dynamic planet. Tectonic plates subduct, ocean floors recycle, sediments bury things, erosion reshapes coastlines. 66 million years is a long time, and a crater on the ocean floor could have been swallowed entirely by subduction. So the search was genuinely difficult. And the answer, when it finally came, arrived from an unexpected direction. In the late 1970s, actually before the Alvarez paper was even published, a geophysicist named Glenn Penfield had been working for the Mexican National Oil Company, Pemex, surveying the Yucatan Peninsula for potential drilling sites. He was looking at gravity and magnetic anomaly maps of the region, and he noticed something strange. There was a huge, almost perfectly semicircular arc of anomalies buried under about a kilometer of younger limestone sediments, centered near a little coastal town called Chicxulub Puerto. The arc was enormous, and when he flipped the offshore gravity data and combined it with the onshore magnetic data, the two arcs completed a circle. A ring roughly 180 kilometers in diameter, buried beneath the surface, invisible to anyone standing on the ground above it. Penfield suspected it was an impact crater. He presented his findings at a geophysics conference in 1981, just a year after the Alvarez paper. But almost nobody noticed. The session was poorly attended, and the abstract didn't get wide circulation. Meanwhile, the impact hypothesis was gaining momentum, and teams around the world were searching for the crater, looking in the oceans, looking in Iowa, looking everywhere except under the limestone of the Yucatan. It wasn't until 1990 that a reporter named Carlos Byers connected Penfield's earlier work with the ongoing search, and Penfield teamed up with Alan Hildebrand, a graduate student who had independently been narrowing down the likely impact site based on the thickness of tektite deposits in the Caribbean region. Together, they confirmed it, the Chicxulub crater, buried under 66 million years of sediment, half on land and half beneath the Gulf of Mexico, sitting there the whole time. The confirmation came through drill cores that Pemex had actually extracted years earlier during oil exploration. Those cores contained shocked quartz, impact melt rock, and breccia, shattered, jumbled rock, consistent with the kind of violence that only an impact produces. The age of the melt rock was dated to 66 million years ago, right at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. It was, as they say, a smoking gun. And not just any gun. The biggest one imaginable. So let's talk about what actually happened on that day. Because this is the part that is both terrifying and, in a strange way, awe-inspiring in its sheer physics. The asteroid, or possibly a fragment of a larger body, some researchers think it may have been a piece of a broken-up comet, though the leading view is that it was a carbonaceous chondrite asteroid, was roughly 12 kilometers across. Think about that. 12 kilometers. That's bigger than Mount Everest is tall. And it was moving at something like 20 kilometers per second. That's about 72,000 kilometers per hour, or roughly 60 times the speed of sound. At that velocity, the air in front of it couldn't get out of the way. It was compressed into a superheated shock wave. The asteroid punched through the entire thickness of the atmosphere in about a single second. 1 second. The atmosphere, from the perspective of this object, was essentially not there. It struck the shallow seas of the Yucatan at an angle. Recent studies suggest somewhere around 60 degrees from horizontal, which turns out to be close to the worst-case scenario for maximizing the amount of material ejected into the atmosphere. The energy released was on the order of 100 teratons of TNT. That number is so large it's basically meaningless in human terms, so let me try to frame it differently. The largest nuclear weapon ever detonated was the Tsar Bomba, at about 50 megatons. The Chicxulub impact released roughly 2 billion times more energy than that. 2 billion Tsar Bombas, all at once, all in one spot. The impact vaporized the asteroid itself, along with a massive volume of the target rock, which happened to be rich in sulfur-bearing evaporates and carbonates. That detail matters enormously, and we'll come back to it. A column of superheated rock vapor and debris shot upward through the atmosphere and into space, creating a plume that expanded outward in all directions. Within minutes, material was raining back down across the entire planet. Those tektites we talked about, molten glass spherules, re-entered the atmosphere at high speed, and there were so many of them that their collective thermal radiation heated the upper atmosphere to oven-like temperatures. Some models suggest that for a period of perhaps 20 to 30 minutes after the impact, the infrared pulse from all that re-entering debris was intense enough to ignite vegetation across much of the planet. Global wildfires. The soot layer found in the boundary clay is consistent with this. It represents the burning of a significant fraction of Earth's terrestrial biomass. Now, close to the impact site, within maybe 1,500 kilometers or so, the devastation was instantaneous and absolute. The shock wave in the rock itself generated magnitude 10 or even magnitude 11 earthquakes, stronger than anything in recorded human history. Tsunamis hundreds of meters high radiated outward through the Gulf of Mexico and into the Atlantic. We've actually found geological evidence of these waves. There are deposits in what is now the southern United States, along the ancient coastlines, showing massive jumbled layers of debris, marine sediment mixed with terrestrial material, all churned together by walls of water that swept far inland. A site called Tanis in North Dakota, which is thousands of kilometers from the impact point, preserves what appears to be a snapshot of the hours immediately following the impact. Fossilized fish with tektite spherules lodged in their gills. They were alive when the glass rain reached them. They breathed it in. But here's the thing about mass extinctions. The initial blast, as catastrophic as it was, isn't really what kills everything. It's the aftermath. The the cascading effects that unfold over weeks, months, and years. And the Chicxulub impact triggered a cascade that was uniquely devastating because of where it hit and what it hit. Remember that the target rock was rich in sulfates and carbonates. When those rocks were vaporized, they released enormous quantities of sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The sulfur dioxide combined with water vapor to form sulfate aerosols, tiny droplets of sulfuric acid suspended in the upper atmosphere. These aerosols, along with the soot from global wildfires and the fine silicate dust from the pulverized rock, formed a shroud around the planet that blocked sunlight. How much sunlight? Enough to effectively shut down photosynthesis. Models suggest that for a period of months, some estimates say up to 2 years, the amount of light reaching the Earth's surface was reduced to a small fraction of normal. Think about what that means. Plants can't photosynthesize. Phytoplankton in the ocean can't photosynthesize. The entire base of the food chain, on land and in the sea, just stops producing energy. Temperatures plummeted. This is sometimes called an impact winter, by analogy with nuclear winter. And in fact, the nuclear winter hypothesis was partly inspired by studies of the Chicxulub aftermath. Global average temperatures may have dropped by as much as 26 degrees Celsius in some models, though the duration and severity are still debated. Even more conservative estimates suggest a drop of 10 to 15 degrees lasting several years. For organisms adapted to the warm, equable climate of the late Cretaceous, a world with no polar ice caps, where crocodilians lived above the Arctic Circle, this was devastating. And then, after the cold, came the heat. Because all that carbon dioxide released from the vaporized limestone didn't go away when the dust settled. CO2 is a greenhouse gas, and once the aerosols and soot rained out of the atmosphere over a period of years, the excess carbon dioxide remained, driving a period of intense greenhouse warming that may have lasted tens of thousands of years. So the survivors of the impact winter then had to contend with a hothouse. And on top of all that, the sulfur dioxide that had been injected into the atmosphere came back down as acid rain, sulfuric acid falling across the planet, acidifying soils and surface waters, dissolving the calcium carbonate shells of marine organisms. The kill list is staggering. All non-avian dinosaurs, gone. Every single one. The mosasaurs, those enormous marine reptiles that had ruled the oceans, gone. The pterosaurs, the flying reptiles, gone. The ammonites, those beautiful coiled shell cephalopods that had been a fixture of the oceans for hundreds of millions of years, survivors of the Permian and Triassic extinctions, finally gone. Roughly 75% of all species on Earth disappeared. In the oceans, the collapse of phytoplankton populations cascaded up through the food web, starving everything that depended on them. On land, the loss of vegetation starved the herbivores, and the loss of herbivores starved the carnivores. The entire structure of terrestrial and marine ecosystems was dismantled in what was, geologically speaking, an instant. But not everything died. And this is where the story gets quietly fascinating, because the pattern of who survived and who didn't tells you something profound about the nature of resilience. Small body size helped, dramatically. Almost nothing larger than about 25 kilograms survived on land. Small mammals, burrowing mammals, animals that could shelter underground and subsist on seeds, insects, detritus. They made it through. Birds survived, but only certain lineages. The ancestors of modern birds, the neornithines, pulled through while the more archaic bird groups perished alongside their dinosaur relatives. In the oceans, organisms that could feed on detritus, rather than relying on the photosynthetic food chain, had a survival advantage. Freshwater ecosystems, which are partly decoupled from the marine photosynthetic base because they receive organic input from land, fared somewhat better than the open ocean. And the Deccan traps, remember those? The massive volcanic eruptions in India that some scientists had championed as the real extinction cause? Here's what's interesting. They were real. They were happening. The main phase of Deccan volcanism bracketed the impact event, with major eruptions occurring both before and after the asteroid struck. Some researchers have argued that the Deccan eruptions had already stressed ecosystems before the impact delivered the final blow, and that the impact itself may have actually intensified the volcanism. The seismic energy from Chicxulub could have destabilized magma chambers on the opposite side of the planet. The current scientific consensus, supported by high-precision geochronology published in the 2010s, is that the asteroid impact was the primary kill mechanism. But the Deccan traps likely played a supporting role, weakening ecosystems beforehand and complicating the recovery afterward. It's not a simple either-or story. It rarely is with extinctions. The recovery from the end Cretaceous extinction is one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of life, and it set the stage for the world you and I live in right now. With the dinosaurs gone, all of them except the birds, ecological niches that had been occupied for over 130 million years were suddenly, violently empty. And into those empty niches, slowly at first, and then with gathering momentum, came the mammals. For most of the Mesozoic, mammals had been small, mostly nocturnal creatures living in the shadows of the dinosaurs. The largest Mesozoic mammals were about the size of a badger. But within a few 100,000 years of the extinction boundary, mammals began diversifying explosively. Within 10 million years, you had the ancestors of whales, bats, primates, horses, elephants. The entire modern mammalian radiation was underway. The world was being rebuilt from scratch, and mammals were the ones doing the building. Now there's something worth pausing on here, because we've now walked through all 5 of the traditional Big 5 mass extinctions: End Ordovician, Late Devonian, End Permian, End Triassic, and End Cretaceous. And if you've been noticing a pattern, you're not imagining it. 4 of the 5 were driven primarily by volcanic processes, massive flood basalt eruptions that destabilized the climate through greenhouse gases, acid rain, ocean anoxia, and ozone destruction. Only one, the End Cretaceous, was triggered by an extraterrestrial impact, and even that one had a volcanic component running alongside it. Volcanism, it turns out, is the great recurring villain in the story of life on Earth. The asteroid was the exception, the outlier, the one-time catastrophe that happened to coincide with a period when the Deccan traps were already pushing the biosphere to its limits. So volcanism is the thread, the deep recurring mechanism, and the asteroid is the dramatic exception that proves the rule. But here's the thing. We've now covered the Big 5, and you might be thinking, okay, that's the list, that's the story, we're done. Except we're not. Because the story of mass extinctions doesn't end 66 million years ago. It continues, and it continues in ways that are both fascinating and, honestly, a little unsettling. Because there have been other significant extinction events since the End Cretaceous, and there's a strong argument, made by serious scientists, not just alarmists, that we are living through one right now. Let's take this slowly, though. Let's not jump straight to the present. Let's first talk about what happened in the tens of millions of years after the dinosaurs disappeared, because the recovery itself tells us something important about how extinction works and what it leaves behind. After the end Cretaceous extinction cleared the stage, the Paleocene epoch began. That's roughly 66 to 56 million years ago. And the early Paleocene was, by all accounts, a strange world. The tropics were hotter than today, the poles were ice-free, and the ecosystems were in a state of flux. Mammals were diversifying rapidly, but they hadn't yet reached the sizes or ecological roles we associate with them now. Forests were recovering, but the composition was different. Ferns and fast-growing pioneer species dominated at first, gradually giving way to more complex plant communities. The oceans were rebuilding their food webs from the bottom up, with new species of foraminifera and plankton replacing the ones that had been wiped out. And then, about 10 million years into this recovery, something happened that's worth knowing about. It's called the Paleocene-Eocene Thermal Maximum, or the PETM, and it occurred roughly 56 million years ago. Now, this wasn't one of the Big Five. It wasn't even close to the same scale of species loss. But it's one of the most important events in Earth's recent geological history, and it's particularly relevant to us today, for reasons that will become clear in a moment. Here's what happened. Over a geologically short period, probably somewhere between a few thousand and 20,000 years, an enormous amount of carbon was released into the atmosphere. We're talking somewhere in the range of several thousand gigatons of carbon. The exact source is still debated. Some researchers point to volcanic intrusions in the North Atlantic, where magma was baking through carbon-rich sediments as Greenland and Europe were pulling apart. Others point to the destabilization of methane hydrates. These are frozen deposits of methane locked in ocean sediments that can release catastrophic amounts of greenhouse gas if the ocean warms past a certain threshold. It was probably some combination of both, with one triggering the other in a feedback loop. The result was dramatic. Global temperatures spiked by about 5 to 8 degrees Celsius over a few thousand years. The deep ocean warmed by 4 to 5 degrees. Ocean chemistry shifted. The water became more acidic as it absorbed excess carbon dioxide, and you can actually see this in the sediment record. There's a layer in deep sea cores where the calcium carbonate fossils just dissolve. They literally disappear from the record because the ocean became too acidic to preserve them. It's called the carbonate dissolution horizon, and it's one of the clearest chemical signatures in the entire Cenozoic. Now, the PETM didn't cause a mass extinction on the scale of the Big Five, but it did cause significant ecological disruption. In the oceans, between 30 and 50% of deep-sea foraminifera species went extinct. On land, there were major shifts in mammalian communities. This is actually when several modern mammalian orders first appear in the fossil record, including the earliest primates in North America and Europe, and the first members of the horse lineage. It's as if the thermal shock reshuffled the ecological deck, opening up opportunities for new groups while pushing others out. And here's why the PETM matters so much to us. The rate of carbon release during the PETM, the fastest natural carbon injection event we can find in the geological record, was somewhere around 1 to 2 gigatons of carbon per year at its peak. That's the fastest nature has ever managed. You want to know what the current rate of human carbon emissions is? About 10 gigatons per year. We are releasing carbon into the atmosphere roughly 5 to 10 times faster than the fastest natural event in at least the last 66 million years. Think about that for a second. The PETM was enough to warm the planet by 5 to 8 degrees, acidify the oceans, and cause significant extinction in the deep sea. And we're doing it faster. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's keep moving through time, because there's more to the story between the PETM and the present. After the PETM, the Earth gradually cooled over the next several tens of millions of years. This long cooling trend is one of the defining features of the Cenozoic era, the era we're still in. Around 34 million years ago, at the boundary between the Eocene and the Oligocene, something momentous happened. Antarctica developed a permanent ice sheet for the first time in hundreds of millions of years. The Drake Passage had opened up between South America and Antarctica, allowing a circumpolar ocean current to form that thermally isolated the southern continent. Temperatures dropped, sea levels fell. The lush forests that had covered Antarctica, yes, Antarctica had forests, with southern beech trees and conifers, gave way to ice. And this transition, sometimes called the Grande Coupure in Europe, caused significant extinctions, particularly among the archaic mammalian fauna of Europe and Asia. Many of the strange early mammalian groups, the creodonts, the mesonychids, various archaic ungulates, were replaced by more modern forms. Then, starting around 2.5 million years ago, the northern hemisphere began its own glaciation. The Pleistocene ice ages began, and for the next 2 million years, the Earth oscillated between glacial periods, when ice sheets advanced as far south as New York and London, and interglacial periods, like the one we're living in now. These cycles were driven by subtle variations in Earth's orbit, the so-called Milankovitch cycles. Changes in the eccentricity of the orbit, the tilt of the axis, and the wobble of the rotational pole, all operating on timescales of tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. Small changes in how much solar energy reached the high latitudes, amplified by feedback loops involving ice reflectivity and carbon dioxide release from warming oceans, were enough to plunge the planet into and out of ice ages. And during the most recent of these glacial-interglacial transitions, something happened that many scientists now consider the opening act of a sixth mass extinction. Starting roughly 50,000 years ago and accelerating dramatically in the last 10,000, a wave of extinctions swept through the world's large animals, the megafauna. And this wave correlates, with uncomfortable precision, not with climate change alone, but with the arrival and spread of one particular species. Us. Let's talk about the megafauna extinctions, because they're genuinely haunting. 50,000 years ago, every habitable continent on Earth had its own spectacular community of large animals. Australia had Diprotodon, a wombat relative the size of a rhinoceros. It had Thylacoleo, a marsupial lion with the most powerful bite force relative to body size of any known mammal. It had giant, short-faced kangaroos that stood 3 meters tall. North America had mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths the size of elephants, saber-toothed cats, American lions bigger than African ones, dire wolves, glyptodonts, armadillo relatives the size of Volkswagen Beetles. South America had its own ground sloths, its own native ungulates, giant terror birds that had survived from the age of dinosaurs. Eurasia had woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, cave lions, cave bears, giant deer with antlers spanning 3.5 meters. And then, one by one, continent by continent, they vanished. Australia lost most of its megafauna between about 46 and 40,000 years ago. Right, around the time humans first arrived on the continent. North and South America lost the majority of theirs between about 13 and 10,000 years ago. Again, shortly after humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge and spread south. Madagascar lost its giant lemurs, elephant birds, and pygmy hippos within the last 2,000 years after human colonization. New Zealand lost its moas, giant flightless birds, some over 3 meters tall, within a few hundred years of Polynesian arrival around the 13th century. The pattern is striking. On every landmass, the megafauna collapse follows human arrival, not climate shifts alone. Africa and southern Asia, where large animals had co-evolved with hominins over millions of years and had time to develop behavioral responses to human hunters, retained more of their megafauna, though even there, losses have been severe. But on continents where humans arrived suddenly as a novel predator, the large animals, the ones that reproduced slowly, that had never encountered a tool-using, cooperative, fire-wielding hunter, were devastated. Now there's genuine scientific debate about how much of this was direct hunting, how much was habitat modification through fire, and how much was climate change doing part of the work. The end of the Pleistocene was, after all, a period of significant climate upheaval. But the timing evidence is hard to argue with. Australia's megafauna disappeared during a period of relatively stable climate. The Americas lost theirs while climate was changing, yes, but they had survived dozens of previous glacial-interglacial cycles without comparable losses. The simplest explanation that fits all the data is that human arrival was the primary driver, with climate acting as a compounding stress in some cases. And this brings us to something that scientists have been discussing with increasing urgency over the past few decades. In 1995, the paleontologist Richard Leakey co-authored a book called The Sixth Extinction, and the term has since entered the scientific mainstream. The biologist E.O. Wilson spent much of his later career warning about catastrophic biodiversity loss, and in 2011, a landmark paper in the journal Nature by Anthony Barnosky and colleagues asked the question directly: has Earth's sixth mass extinction already arrived? Their answer was carefully worded but sobering. Current extinction rates, they found, are dramatically elevated above the background rate, perhaps 100 to 1,000 times higher than normal, depending on the taxonomic group and how you calculate it. If the species currently listed as critically endangered were to go extinct within the next few centuries, which is plausible without intervention, the resulting loss would rival the Big Five within as few as 3 to 22 centuries. Now that's a projection, not a certainty. And it's worth being precise here. We are not yet at Big Five levels of species loss. The end Permian killed 90% of marine species. We haven't done that. But the rate of loss, the speed at which species are disappearing, is what alarms biologists. Because in every past mass extinction, the killing happened fast by geological standards, but still took thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. What's happening now is happening in centuries, decades even. And the mechanisms are different this time. There's no asteroid. There are no flood basalts, at least not volcanic ones. Instead, the drivers are habitat destruction, deforestation, wetland drainage, urbanization, overexploitation, invasive species, pollution, and increasingly, climate change driven by those same carbon emissions we talked about with the PETM. The parallel to the PETM is actually instructive because it shows us that the Earth system has been through rapid carbon injections before, and the consequences were real but survivable on geological timescales. The difference now is the speed and the fact that ecosystems are already stressed by multiple pressures simultaneously. That's the key distinction. In the past, an extinction event usually had one dominant driver: volcanism, glaciation, and impact. Life was otherwise doing its thing, and then this massive perturbation hit. Today, species are contending with several major stressors at once, and that compounding effect is something we don't have a clean analog for in the geological record. Think about it this way. Imagine a forest in Southeast Asia. A particular species of frog lives in that forest. Maybe it's found nowhere else on Earth, which is actually common for amphibians. That frog is already dealing with habitat loss because the forest is being logged or converted to palm oil plantation. At the same time, a fungal pathogen called Batrachochytrium dendrobatidis, chytrid fungus, if you want the shorthand, has been spreading globally, devastating amphibian populations on every continent. And on top of that, the local climate is shifting, altering rainfall patterns, changing the timing of the wet season that the frog depends on for breeding. Any one of those pressures might be survivable. All three together? That's a different equation entirely, and that scenario isn't hypothetical. It's playing out right now across thousands of species in thousands of places. Amphibians are actually a good group to focus on for a moment because they've become something of a canary in the coal mine for the broader extinction crisis. A massive global assessment published in 2004, the Global Amphibian Assessment, found that nearly a third of all amphibian species were threatened with extinction. A third. And at least 122 species had likely gone extinct since 1980. That's in just 24 years. The chytrid fungus alone has been linked to the decline of over 500 amphibian species worldwide, with roughly 90 of those presumed extinct. It's been called the most destructive pathogen in recorded history in terms of biodiversity loss, which is a staggering claim when you think about all the diseases that have swept through human and animal populations over the centuries. And here's the thing that makes the current situation so different from, say, the end Ordovician or even the end Permian. In those events, the killing was indiscriminate in a sense. It was driven by global environmental changes that affected entire ecosystems uniformly. Ocean chemistry shifted, temperatures swung, and whatever couldn't adapt or find refuge died. The current crisis is more surgical in some ways and more chaotic in others. We're removing specific habitats, draining this particular wetland, clearing that particular ridge of forest. We're introducing specific invasive predators to specific islands. We're targeting specific species through hunting or fishing. But we're also changing the global climate, which is the kind of broad, indiscriminate pressure that does echo past extinctions. It's both targeted and diffuse at the same time, which makes it uniquely difficult to manage. Let's talk about the climate piece specifically, because that's where the deep time perspective becomes genuinely useful. We spent some time earlier on the PETM, that event about 56 million years ago, when a massive pulse of carbon entered the atmosphere. Global temperatures spiked by 5 to 8 degrees Celsius, and the oceans acidified significantly. That event is the closest geological analog we have to what's happening now with anthropogenic carbon emissions. But there's a critical difference in tempo. The best estimates suggest the carbon release during the PETM occurred over something like 3,000 to 20,000 years. Current human emissions are injecting carbon into the atmosphere roughly 10 times faster than even the most rapid estimates for the PETM. We're running the same experiment, but we've hit fast forward. Now, the Earth recovered from the PETM. Life went on. New species evolved to fill the gaps left by those that disappeared. But that recovery took tens of thousands of years, and the world that emerged on the other side was different. The question isn't really whether life on Earth will survive the current crisis. Of course it will, in some form. Life survived the end Permian, which was far worse than anything we're likely to cause. The question is, what kind of world emerges on the other side, and on what timescale, and whether human civilization, as we know it, is part of that picture. And that brings us to something that scientists have started thinking about more carefully in recent years: the concept of tipping points. In complex systems, And Earth's climate and biosphere are about as complex as systems get. There are thresholds beyond which change becomes self-reinforcing. You push the system a little, and it pushes back, finds a new equilibrium close to where it started. But push it past a certain point, and it starts pulling itself in the new direction. The change accelerates on its own, even if you stop pushing. We've seen this in the geological record. The onset of Antarctic glaciation at the Eocene-Oligocene boundary, around 34 million years ago. Remember that transition? Carbon dioxide levels had been declining gradually for millions of years, but the ice sheet didn't grow gradually. It appeared relatively suddenly, geologically speaking, within a few 100,000 years. Once conditions crossed a threshold, the ice albedo feedback kicked in. White ice reflects more sunlight, which cools the surface further, which grows more ice, and the system snapped into a new state. That's a tipping point. Today, climate scientists have identified several potential tipping points in the current Earth system. The collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet, which sits on bedrock below sea level and is vulnerable to warming ocean water melting it from beneath. The die-off of the Amazon rainforest, which generates a significant fraction of its own rainfall through transpiration. If enough forest is removed, the remainder may not be able to sustain itself, and the whole system could flip to savanna. The thawing of Arctic permafrost, which contains vast stores of organic carbon that, once thawed, would be decomposed by microbes and released as carbon dioxide and methane, further warming the climate in a feedback loop. Each of these is a system that could, in principle, reach a point of no return. And here's what makes this relevant to our extinction story. Past mass extinctions often involved exactly these kinds of cascading feedbacks. The end Permian didn't kill 90% of marine species through a single mechanism. The Siberian traps erupted, releasing carbon dioxide. That warmed the climate. The warming may have destabilized methane hydrates on the ocean floor. Frozen deposits of methane locked in ice-like structures in deep-sea sediments, releasing even more greenhouse gas. The oceans warmed, which reduced their ability to hold dissolved oxygen, spreading anoxia. The anoxia killed marine life, which disrupted the biological pump that normally draws carbon out of surface waters, which may have increased atmospheric carbon further. Feedback upon feedback upon feedback, each one amplifying the others. The initial volcanic trigger was severe, but it was the cascading system response that made it catastrophic. So when scientists today worry about tipping points, they're not being alarmist. They're drawing on exactly the kind of deep time evidence we've been walking through all evening. They're saying, we know from the geological record that Earth's systems can flip states, that feedbacks can amplify initial perturbations, and that the results can be devastating for biodiversity. The question is whether we're approaching any of those thresholds now. The honest answer is that we don't know precisely where all the thresholds lie. Climate models have become remarkably sophisticated. They can simulate ocean circulation, atmospheric chemistry, ice sheet dynamics, vegetation responses. But the interactions between these systems are so complex that precise tipping points are hard to pin down. What we do know is the direction of travel and the speed. There's a researcher named Will Steffen, an Earth system scientist who spent much of his career at the Australian National University, who co-authored an influential paper in 2018 exploring the concept of what he and his colleagues called hothouse Earth. The paper argued that even if human emissions were brought under control, a cascade of self-reinforcing feedbacks could potentially lock the planet into a trajectory of continued warming well beyond what we intended. It was a sobering paper, widely discussed, and it drew explicitly on paleoclimate data, including the kinds of events we've been talking about, to make its case. But let me pull back from the alarm for a moment, because there's another side to this story, and it's equally grounded in the geological record. Life on Earth is extraordinarily resilient. We've seen that over and over tonight. After the end Ordovician, marine ecosystems rebuilt. After the late Devonian, vertebrates eventually conquered the land. After the end Permian, the worst catastrophe in the history of complex life, the biosphere recovered, slowly, painfully, but completely, and the world that emerged was richer and stranger than what came before. Dinosaurs arose from the ashes of the end Permian recovery. Mammals arose from the ashes of the end Cretaceous. Every mass extinction, without exception, was followed by an adaptive radiation, an explosion of new forms filling the emptied ecological space. That pattern tells us something profound about the nature of life itself. It's not fragile. Individual species are fragile. Ecosystems are fragile. But life as a phenomenon, the tendency of self-replicating chemistry to diversify, adapt, and fill every available niche, that's about as robust as anything in the universe. 4 billion years of continuity through snowball Earths and acid oceans and asteroid impacts and supervolcanic winters. Life has never come close to being fully extinguished, which doesn't mean we shouldn't care about the current crisis. It means we should be precise about what we're trying to protect and why. And that brings us to something that I think is worth sitting with for a moment. The relationship between extinction and the relationship between extinction and value. Because those two things aren't as straightforward as they might seem at first. When we talk about losing species, when we say that current extinction rates are 100 or 1,000 times the background rate, there's an implicit assumption underneath that statement. The assumption is that each species lost represents something irreplaceable. And that's true, but it's worth unpacking why it's true. Because the reasons are layered, and some of them are surprising. The most obvious reason is ecological. Every species plays a role in its ecosystem: pollinator, predator, decomposer, nitrogen fixer, seed disperser. Remove one, and the web adjusts, sometimes gracefully, sometimes not. You've probably heard the term keystone species, coined by the ecologist Robert Payne in 1969 after his experiments with sea stars in tidal pools along the coast of Washington state. Payne removed a single predator, the ochre sea star, Pisaster ocraceus, from a stretch of rocky shoreline and watched what happened. Without the sea star keeping mussel populations in check, the mussels took over, crowding out barnacles, algae, limpets, and anemones. A community of 15 species collapsed to about 8. One removal, and the whole architecture changed. That's a dramatic example, and not every species is a keystone. Some are more like rivets in an airplane wing. You can lose a few and the wing holds, but you don't know which rivet is the critical one until it's too late. That analogy actually comes from Paul Ehrlich and Anne Ehrlich, who used it in their 1981 book on extinction. It's a little imperfect as analogies go, because ecosystems are more flexible than airplane wings. They can rewire, reroute, find new configurations. But the core point stands. Redundancy has limits. Lose enough pieces, and the system doesn't just degrade gradually. It can shift abruptly into a different state, a less productive one, a less stable one. And you often can't predict where the threshold is. So that's the ecological argument, and it's powerful. But there's another layer that I find even more compelling, and it's the one that connects most directly to everything we've been talking about tonight. Each species represents an unbroken lineage of evolutionary experimentation stretching back billions of years. Think about what that means. A frog species alive today, say the golden toad of Monteverde, which we mentioned earlier, the one that vanished in 1989, that species carried in its genome the accumulated solutions to every environmental challenge its ancestors faced, going back to the first tetrapods crawling out of Devonian swamps, back further to lobe-finned fish, back further still to the earliest chordates of the Cambrian. 370 million years of refinement, of trial and error, of molecular innovation. Proteins that fold in particular ways, immune strategies, developmental pathways, skin compounds. The golden toad's relatives produce peptides with antimicrobial properties that pharmaceutical researchers have barely begun to explore. When that species goes extinct, all of that information, that deep library of biological solutions, is gone, permanently, no backup copy. And here's the thing, we can't reconstruct it. We can sequence DNA from preserved specimens, sometimes, and that's valuable. But a genome without a living organism to express it is like sheet music without instruments. The organism is the performance, the way its genes interact with its environment, the way its behavior shapes its ecosystem, the way it responds to challenges we haven't even thought to test. All of that embodied knowledge disappears. It's not like losing a book from a library. It's like losing a language that was never written down. This is what E.O. Wilson meant when he called biodiversity the most information-rich part of the biological world. He wasn't being sentimental. He was making an information-theoretic argument. Each species is a unique solution set, shaped by a unique evolutionary history, encoding possibilities we don't fully understand, and we're erasing them faster than we can catalog them. Current estimates suggest there are roughly 8 to 10 million eukaryotic species on Earth, and we've formally described maybe 1.5 to 2 million of them. We are losing species we haven't even named yet. Species in tropical forest canopies, in deep-sea sediments, in soil microbiomes, organisms whose very existence is unknown to science, blinking out before anyone gets a chance to study them. That should give you pause, not panic, pause, because the honest truth is, we don't know exactly what we're losing, and that uncertainty cuts both ways. Maybe some of those unknown species are ecologically redundant, and their loss won't ripple far. But maybe some of them hold the key to a future antibiotic, or a drought-resistant crop gene, or an enzyme that could break down plastic waste. We genuinely don't know, and that not knowing is itself a kind of loss. But let me balance this with something else the geological record teaches us, because I think it's important not to end a night like this on a note of pure anxiety. We've walked through 4.5 billion years together, give or take. We've watched the planet freeze solid and thaw. We've watched oxygen poison an entire biosphere, and then become the foundation for complex life. We've watched the worst mass extinction in history, the end Permian, kill 90% of marine species. And then we've watched life come back, not just to its previous level of diversity, but beyond it, into forms that the pre-extinction world could never have produced. Dinosaurs, flowering plants, mammals, birds. Every catastrophe opened doors that had been closed. That doesn't make the catastrophes good. The suffering was real. If you can speak of suffering in organisms that may or may not have experienced it consciously. The loss was real. Entire evolutionary lineages, entire ways of being alive, were erased forever. The trilobites never came back. The non-avian dinosaurs never came back. The specific, particular, unrepeatable forms of life that existed before each extinction. Those were gone. But life itself, the process, the tendency, the relentless creativity of evolution, that endured, and it always found new ways forward. So when we think about the current moment, this strange, unprecedented period where a single species, us, has become a geological force comparable to asteroid impacts and supervolcanic eruptions, the question isn't really whether life will survive. It almost certainly will. Bacteria will be fine, fungi will be fine. Cockroaches and rats and jellyfish and crows, organisms that thrive in disturbed environments, they'll probably do quite well. The question is what kind of world we want to live in, and what kind of world we want to leave behind. That's not really a scientific question anymore. It's a human one. But it's informed by science, deeply informed, and especially by the kind of deep time perspective we've been building all night. Because when you understand how long it takes to build the kind of biodiversity we currently have, when you understand that the recovery from a mass extinction typically takes 5 to 10 million years, you realize that whatever we lose in the next century or two, we're not getting back on any timescale that matters to human civilization. 10 million years. That's roughly 2,000 times longer than all of recorded human history. The world can recover, but we won't be around to see it. Not as we are now, anyway. And that reframing, I think, is what makes the paleontological perspective so valuable. It's not about doom. It's about scale. It's about understanding where we sit in a story that's been unfolding for 4 billion years, and recognizing that we're both a product of that story and, for the first time, a conscious participant in it. No other species in the history of Earth has understood what a mass extinction is. No other species has been able to look at the fossil record and say, "Oh, this has happened before, and here's what it looked like, and here's what caused it, and here's what came after." We're the first. That's extraordinary. When you think about it, we're the first living things on this planet to understand the planet's own history. And that understanding comes with a kind of responsibility that's hard to articulate, but easy to feel. You feel it when you stand in a museum and look at a fossil of a creature that lived 300 million years ago, a creature that breathed and moved and responded to its world, that had descendants for millions of years, and then didn't. You feel the weight of time, the depth of the story, and your own smallness within it, but also your own peculiar significance. Because you're the one who can read the story. You're the one who can look at a layer of iridium in a cliff face in Gubbio, Italy, and understand that it marks the day the sky caught fire. You're the one who can hold a piece of Permian limestone and know that the creatures preserved in it were killed by volcanic gases from Siberia, half a world away, 252 million years ago. That knowledge is a kind of gift, and tonight we've been unwrapping it slowly, layer by layer, the way you'd read the strata themselves, starting from the deepest, oldest foundations and working our way up toward the present. We started with the formation of the Earth, that molten, chaotic beginning. We watched the first self-replicating molecules figure out how to persist. We watched cyanobacteria poison the atmosphere with oxygen and accidentally create the conditions for everything that followed. We watched the Cambrian explosion populate the seas with forms so strange they looked like they were designed by committee. And then we watched the great dyings, one after another, each with its own character, its own causes, its own aftermath. The end Ordovician, driven by glaciation and falling sea levels, quiet and cold. the late Devonian, drawn out and mysterious, possibly linked to the greening of the land, the end Permian, the great dying, volcanic and suffocating and nearly total, the end Triassic, volcanic again, clearing the stage for the dinosaurs' long reign, and the end Cretaceous, sudden and violent, an asteroid, and a bad day that became the mammal's great opportunity. Each one different, each one devastating, each one, in the long run, generative. And now here we are, lying in the dark, thinking about deep time, which is honestly one of the best things you can do with a quiet evening. Because deep time is humbling in the gentlest possible way. It doesn't diminish you. It contextualizes you. It places you in a story so vast and so strange and so endlessly creative that your own problems, your own anxieties, your own to-do list, your own sleepless thoughts, they don't disappear, but they settle. They find their proportion. 4.5 billion years. That's how long this planet has been working on the project of being alive. And in all that time, through every catastrophe, every extinction, every frozen ocean and burning sky, the project continued. Life found a way. It always found a way. Not the same way, not the easy way, but a way. And tonight, as you drift toward sleep, you're part of that continuity. You're made of atoms that were forged in stars, assembled into molecules in ancient oceans, organized into cells that learn to cooperate, sculpted by 4 billion years of evolution, into a body that can lie here in the dark and wonder about all of this. Every breath you take uses oxygen that cyanobacteria first released into the atmosphere over 2 billion years ago. Every bone in your body follows a body plan that was roughed out in the Cambrian. You are, in the most literal sense, a product of everything we've talked about tonight. So let that settle over you. Let the weight of deep time become something comfortable, like a blanket. The story is vast, and it's still being written, and you're part of it. The species that figured out its own history. The species that looked back across the eons and understood, that's not a small thing. That's maybe the most remarkable thing that's happened on this planet in 4.5 billion years. And the night is quiet now, and the story can rest. The strata will still be there in the morning. The limestone and the shale and the iridium layer and the fossils pressed into stone. The deep record of everything that lived and died and made way for what came next. It's patient, that record. It's been waiting for billions of years. It can wait a little longer while you sleep.